Janine Zacharia, former Middle East bureau chief for the Washington Post, who covered the State Department for many years under Condi Rice and has a vast amount of experience in that. Janine, just listening to those two clips, what's your take?
Well, I think the main takeaway from all this is that, in fact, even given the horrors of perhaps up to 1,400 people gassed to death last week, is that this whole operation that looks to be forthcoming is really more about reestablishing American credibility and deterrence than it is about punishing Assad for the use of these chemical weapons. I mean, you heard Secretary Kerry and President Obama really stress this notion that it's really about preventing other thugs or rogue states from taking away from inaction the idea that they could just do it. I mean, so I think it's interesting that if the president hadn't stated that chemical weapons was a red line, we may not be on the brink of a U.S. attack.
So, in your view, this really little to do, or a minimal amount to do with Bashar Assad or Syria, but more to do, in fact, with other countries that might consider using chemical weapons or weapons of mass destruction of another kind. It's just an act of deterrence to reestablish American strength and credibility in this area. In fact, if you notice, I don't think it was in the clip that I played, but in his full statement, John Kerry actually made reference to Iraq and reestablishing American credibility almost explicitly, saying you have to believe us when we tell you these things.
Yeah, I don't know if it's about reestablishing credibility of American intelligence as much as American credibility about its own threats, right? I mean, because, and I think, look, the president's in a tough position here, obviously, because on the one hand, you don't want to let the use of chemical weapons go unchecked because other nations like Iran, North Korea, other states that sort of find themselves outside the community of nations that operate under a certain set of norms, you don't want them to feel that they can do this, and you just don't want to let a rogue like Bashar al-Assad kill 1,400 people with chemical weapons. But on the other hand, he's explicitly not trying to topple Bashar al-Assad because of the nature of this Syrian opposition, namely that it includes people affiliated with al-Qaeda who are, we've decided, the United States, are more abhorrent to our interests. So on the face of it, the Syrian, just doing it because of Syria, it's tough to make the case, right? So they've got to broaden it out to this issue, and I think it's right that by attacking, they're sending a message to everyone that we are not going to tolerate you gassing your own people.
And this was, that al-Qaeda element is exactly what a lot of people have picked up on. In fact, Dennis Kucinich, the former representative, current Fox News commentator, oddly, said that if we do this, we become al-Qaeda's Air Force. I think that's obviously a good turn of a phrase, and it's overstating the matter pretty significantly, but there is the kernel of truth there. There's an essential truth about that, in that, as you point out, many of the elements of the Syrian opposition are made up of elements of al-Qaeda, or those that are sympathetic to al-Qaeda. And in fact, I read, I think yesterday, that there's maybe one faction within the Syrian resistance, the Free Syrian Army, that is could in any way be characterized as secular or palatable to Western interests.
That's right, and so that's why you've got opposition to this operation from both Democrats and Republicans. It's pretty across the board. In fact, the entire international community seems to not be lining up with us on this. I mean, the polls are not even letting us overfly in order to carry out any kinds of attacks. I mean, we can do it from the sea with tomahawks and things like that from the Navy, but it's and that's why President Obama stressed that this was, quote, about the narrow concern about chemical weapons. The problem is that very often you can start out with a narrow objective and then sort of get bogged down in a situation that you didn't intend, right? That's not beyond the realm of possibility here. What I expect will happen is that sometime in the next 48 or 72 hours, before the UN inspectors have completed their report for the United Nations, the U.S. is going to strike at military targets. And while there are fears that Bashar al-Assad will launch, say, Syrian Scuds towards Israel, or that Iran, along with Syria, will authorize Hezbollah to strike Israel from the north, I think either A, that's not going to happen, or B, if they do, the Israelis will be able to contain it.
Janine, let me pause you right there because we've got to take a break for traffic and weather. When we come back, what I want to ask is, since you make reference to the upcoming American strike and everybody seems to believe that it really is imminent, isn't the risk greater that once this strike occurs and it appears to have been totally ineffectual, which it looks like, I mean, look, we don't know yet, but given everything that we know at this point, how the administration is going to say that it had any effect whatsoever when Assad remains in power and in possession of chemical weapons, how anyone is going to say that that is a reasonable or effective response to what we claim to be outraged about, we don't know. Want to talk about that with you as well when we come back, and the broader implications through the rest of the Middle East and some possible alternatives to military action. Traffic and weather first with Colonel Shaggy.
Right, there is an incident at 290 Northwest HOV westbound at Mangum Road. That is slowing down really a 610 West Loop heading southbound between 290 and 59, running at 30 miles an hour and less there. Outbound traffic on 290 Northwest all the way out to Highway 6. You're looking at speeds of 25 miles an hour. Outbound traffic on 45 North, 25 miles an hour out to Shepherd. Inbound traffic on 59 North Freeway, expect speeds of 20 miles an hour and less throughout downtown. Heading southbound, northbound on 59 Southwest Freeway, expect speeds of 10 miles an hour inside of Shepherd. And it is 94 degrees outside, feels like 105. Clear skies today with some clouds mixed in. Clear skies tonight, 75 degrees. Tomorrow's going to be a high of 99, low of 73, and it's going to pretty much be like this all throughout the weekend. Highs of 104 on Tuesday, however. Back to you, Geoff.
All right, talking to Janine Zacharia, former Washington Post Middle East bureau chief, worked at the State Department before that, currently at Stanford University. And Janine, I want to ask you a compound question and just let you run with it. There are so many possible ramifications of this, but it seems to me one of the primary negative ramifications is that if we are going to engage in a limited strike, as the president said repeatedly, in fact emphasized when he made his statement today, no boots on the ground, very limited strike for a narrow purpose, and we send some Tomahawk cruise missiles or fly a few bombing sorties over Syria, and the effect is really no noticeable reduction in Bashar Assad's ability to wage war against his own people, and that war continues and Bashar Assad remains in power, isn't it worse, or couldn't an argument not be made that it is in fact worse than to have done nothing, because the United States will have made itself look weak having done something like that, having conducted a military operation with no discernible effect? Is there not an alternative to that? Is the alternative not a stronger attack of some kind? Could there be boots on the ground that secure chemical weapons, destroy them and take them out, since that's our stated goal, to prevent future use of these weapons? What are the possibilities of that through some special forces? Or could the United States not find a non-military alternative to this, even at this point when the United States has been so bellicose and its rhetoric's been so threatening and hinting so strongly that a military operation is upcoming? Could the United States not work closely with, say, Russia, which is very close with Syria, and possibly engineer a coup of some kind, do something that does not entail risking American credibility, lives, money, and everything else? Janine.
Look, I think that the president is trying to fire a warning shot here, right? With the idea of a limited strike, take out some of his prized assets, and maybe through that, coax him A, not to gas his people anymore, and B, sort of say, okay, we're giving you a chance to stay in power and perhaps come to the negotiating table, which has been, behind the scenes, or what the United States has been trying to do. They've been trying to broker some kind of a ceasefire between the opposition and Assad, which Secretary Kerry has failed miserably at this. It's not his fault. It's a difficult situation, but they haven't been able, without any military intervention, to get them to come to the negotiating table. So some people, I think, believe that if he's a little bit reduced, that he will, in fact, maybe at some point come to the negotiating table. I think there's more damage to American credibility at this point by doing nothing than there is by doing something. It's not that it doesn't carry its own risks, but to let that kind of attack on civilians go unanswered, would be an enormous, we would look even weaker than we already look now, and it would be very dangerous for us and for our allies. There is truth to the idea that by not doing something, we are endangering our national security in a long-term way. On the other hand, I am worried that by focusing so much on this as a punishment for the use of chemical weapons, that you are, ipso facto, you're sort of counseling the idea that it's okay to kill your people with conventional weapons. Let's remember that while maybe 1,400 people, including 400 children, were gassed to death, that 100,000 Syrians have died in the past 2 years, most of them by Syrian conventional forces. So are we saying that it's okay to kill people with regular force? Because that could be Assad's takeaway as well.
And I think that's certainly a reasonable conclusion based on the world's response. There's been, but look, you can certainly make that case. And in fact, I think the case should be made because in the 90s, Janine, as I know you recall, in Rwanda, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed by machetes. I mean, the most conventional, if you will, types of weapons. The world did nothing. And I think that President Clinton has said that the greatest regret of his presidency was not intervening in Rwanda and doing something about that genocide. This, I don't think, can be characterized as a genocide. This is not this is not a large-scale attack on people because of their ethnic background in an attempt to eradicate them from the earth. This is genuinely a civil war, though clearly there are ethnic and religious undertones to it. So what would you say if you're I don't want to say if you're advising the State Department, but what do you think the State Department's thinking is in terms of that position, in terms of drawing a line between how it's okay to kill people with conventional weapons and how it's not okay to kill people with weapons of mass destruction? How do you justify that?
I mean, the State Department has decided, the international community, in fact, has decided with the Convention on Chemical Weapons that you can never use these weapons. You just can't. And that's just, and even though Syria, I believe, is one of 5 countries out of all the countries in the world who never signed the Convention on Chemical Weapons, the international community takes this as a fact that you just can't use these weapons. So that's where they've drawn the line, and that's why the U.S. is acting. It's really quite simple. For the very reason that you said, there are horrible things that happen every day around the world, in Africa, in North Korea, which we never talk about, where we don't intervene, right? And some of it is realpolitik, where we can intervene and do something, we will. Or where we can link it to our national security interests, we will. But it's not very often that the U.S. acts purely on humanitarian grounds. And it's a broader question for this president and the next president of what the U.S. role is going to be globally and whether or not humanitarianism or doing something about the way rogue states treat their own people when it's beyond the realm of our imagination, what they're doing, should be part of our foreign policy. And we really haven't answered that question. That's why we intervened in Libya, but we haven't intervened in Syria till now, where we don't know what to do about Egypt when the military kills 1,000 people too. So we're kind of all over the place right now.
That really leads to another question, which is I don't think I'm really being overly critical when I say that what that leads to is a question about the absolutely horrible way the Obama administration has handled all of this. The UK Parliament, not that the Obama administration has any control over that, but Parliament in the UK yesterday, the House of Commons, voted against using any military force, joining the United States using military force against Syria. David Cameron, the Conservative Prime Minister of the UK, said that he will respect the will of the House and not participate in any operation with the United States, though he had clearly planned to up to that point. So that leaves the United States kind of flailing around looking for allies to go on this operation with, and that I think at this point probably leaves France, and I'm not sure who else. So, can you talk about just a little bit the way that the Obama administration, I mean that's one aspect. That's obviously the international aspect. The other is domestically. The polls show overwhelmingly people are opposed to any type of military action in Syria. Now, that you can argue that on the merits, good, bad, indifferent, but what it tells me is that the Obama administration and the president in particular has just not done anything to bring public opinion around to doing something this serious. You do not just jump into some military conflict and expect the people to follow you. I mean, in every precedent, in every case where there is a precedent, the president himself has taken the lead role in addressing the nation and going out and making the argument, explaining why this is necessary and there really are no alternatives. The president just hasn't done that here. What's your read?
Well, I think on the first question, or your first point, I think on the face of it, it does look like a debacle of diplomacy after what happened with the Brits. On the other hand, it sort of reminds me about Iraq. We went to the United Nations. We tried to get authorization there. I think the French vetoed in the end. I can't remember, Geoff, exactly. But it was, and then we just kind of did it on our own. And so you try and build this international coalition. And if you can't do it, you've got to act in what you see are your either international responsibilities or your interests. So, yes, I think that they probably should have gotten all their ducks in a row with the Brits, with the French, with everybody behind the scenes, rather than letting this play out like this. I mean, one of the things I'm really concerned about is that the delay here, while everybody's sort of talking publicly about everything, is allowing Assad to move the assets that are likely to be struck into civilian neighborhoods, right? So a lot of rockets and things are being put in schools, troops are being relocated. I mean, you can still hit the airfields and planes and things, right, and rocket Scud launchers, but a lot of the assets are being moved. So that increases the chance of collateral damage, civilian casualties, and then a U.S. strike, okay? The issue of public diplomacy, this has been another problem. I mean, after the gas attack, I think it was a deputy White House spokesman that issued a press release or something like that. The president was on vacation. It wasn't something that he really wanted to be out publicly on, and I think that just illustrates just how much he does not want to get involved in all of this, right? Yeah. But again, if you're the average American and you're kind of going about your day and you're watching NFL preseason and Miley Cyrus and whatever, and then suddenly the president says we're about to launch military operations in Syria, they're kind of like, what? He hasn't been talking about Syria, even though this has been a major foreign policy concern for over 2 years. There's been very little talk, in fact, about the results of the Arab Spring in general or the Middle East. The only time people seem to wake up is if if it affects stock prices. And I think there does need to be more concerted public diplomacy explaining of what exactly is the U.S. role going to be in this more tumultuous Middle East going forward.
So do you foresee a greater effort on the part of the president? I mean, is the president going to address the nation? Is he going to start making the case? I
can't imagine that before they actually say they go in over the weekend, he'll probably do one of these Oval Office addresses at night where he sits behind the table and sort of explains, the U.S. is about to launch Tomahawk missiles at Damascus. Here's why, type of thing.
NBC has a poll out today showing the president's approval rating at 44%, which is about as low as it's ever been. I think the second lowest it's been in throughout the course of his entire presidency. And I just cannot imagine. He's got no political capital to spend, and I cannot imagine what getting involved in a conflict that an overwhelming number of Americans do not want to get involved in without first making the case, without bringing people along, will do to his political capital, such as it is right now. It seems to be at a low ebb, but maybe he's got a greater plan. I want to ask you finally, Janine, before we go, do you see this escalating? I mean, John Kerry and the president were at pains today, and everyone in the administration, all the reporting is that they are at pains to explain that this is going to be limited, it's going to be short, that their goal is not to topple the Assad regime. They've already got pushback from Turkey, the Turkish prime minister, saying that any action should have the ultimate goal of toppling Assad. But, okay, all of that aside, knowing all of that, going in, do you see this? I mean, the Syrian response, I think the strategy would be to do its best to make it unlimited, to draw it out as long as possible, bring in Hezbollah, bring in Israel, maybe bring in Turkey, do all of these things. Though it may be bringing a sort of a world of hurt on itself, it would be expanding the war in a way that Americans would never support. Do you foresee an expansion of the conflict?
Geoff, Bashar al-Assad is a minority ruler, okay? An Alawite kind of Shia ruler, majority hostile Sunni population who hate him, right? He has one goal only. It's not to widen the war. It's not to necessarily escalate. It's to stay in power. So his calculation is going to be, how am I going to stay in power after this, right? So if he decides he's got enough resources to, shoot some scuds at Israel or whatever and sort of try and bring Israel into this, make this about Israel and, the proxy of the United States, blah, 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 he might do it. he might just hunker down for a while and wait for everything to settle, and the civil war will continue for another year. That's my guess. We had a lot of bad people fall in the Middle East recently, including Muammar Gaddafi, and he was killing his own people too, and everybody said, oh my God, it's going to escalate, and that was over pretty quickly. So I don't know. On the other hand, he's the most vicious of the vicious dictators right now. So a lot of whether this is going to escalate is going to depend on one thing, his response to this limited military strike that is about to happen.
Janine Zacharia, formerly of the Washington Post, currently of Stanford University. I saw you on Al Jazeera recently.
Yeah, what do you think?
I thought it was terrific. It was trenchant.
It's a good channel. I mean, they're doing real news today. I couldn't find anything about Miley Cyrus. They were doing Syria, Egypt, the Yosemite fires, all the stories I follow.
So you feel as though you are not really being kept up to date on the twerking, all of the twerking going on in America because you've been watching Al Jazeera.
It's true, and I'm a little embarrassed to say that the twerking thing caught me a little bit by surprise. I wasn't in real time updated on that.
I'm ashamed to have had someone so ill-informed on my program for such an extended period of time. All right, now are you going to be on again? Because I want some more of this analysis.
I hope so. If your listeners will tolerate me,
I think that they will. I will, and I have absolutely no influence or say. So there you go. Janine Zacharia, thank you very much for joining us. Al Jazeera now broadcasting the United States, and she was on I think it was last week?
In their launch week. On Tuesday the 20th.
Tuesday the 20th. All right. So she was on with P.J. Crowley, former State Department official.
It's worth checking out.
It's worth checking out. Janine, thank you again. Have a great Labor Day weekend, and we'll be back in touch, I'm sure, as this develops. 713-526-5738.